Hi friends, it's Lisa Hetrick, illustrator for Gina K Designs, and I'm so grateful you could join me today. I have a really easygoing watercolor technique to share with you today. I get a lot of questions about no line watercoloring, and it can be kind of challenging or it can look super challenging. But I'm going to demystify it a little bit today. I'm using my Wildflowers and Weeds stamp set with Gina K, and I'm picking the pansy and the solid leafery from this set. Now, I've already pre-stamped this down using Whisper Amalgam ink. So it's very light, and we are going to do no line watercoloring and watercolor over top of the solid image and the line art image. And I'm just going to show you my super easygoing technique for creating that no line watercolor look. Okay, we're going to dive in here. I've got some watercolor and I have a brush. Now you can grab whatever you have in your stash. I'm using a number 6 round, and I'm just getting it nice and juicy with water. And I'm using some cotton watercolor paper. I'll have all of the links for the supplies that I'm using listed below. We're really going to focus on the technique, but you can modify this look with any of the supplies you have in your stash. I'm using pan watercolors. You could use tube watercolors. You could use water-based markers. So what I've done is I've just painted a ton of water over the whole stamped image. And now I've got a little bit of violet watercolor, and you can see that I'm just dropping it in over top the pansy here. The technique I'm using is called wet into wet. The brush is wet, the paper is wet, and I'm just dropping the pigment down here. Now, I just tapped off a little bit of it because I just want to get a concentration of that violet watercolor and just get what I'm calling my first layer of watercolor. The magic to this technique that I'm going to teach you is layering color on top of color to create that variation from lights to darks. So I've got my heat tool here, and I'm just going to zap this and just dry it off so that I can move on to the leaves here. So I'm just giving it a good quick zap of heat without burning my fingers, so that we can go ahead and work on the leaves. Now, I could just let it dry on its own, but the leaves are touching it, and I don't want those two colors to bleed into each other right now. Okay, now that that's dry, I'm going to skip over the leaves for right now, and I'm layering in with my brush. So my brush is wet, my paper is dry, my brush is loaded up with that violet watercolor pigment, and I'm just dabbing it in to the center of the flower here and just layering it in. And now I'm cleaning my brush, and I'm going to go back and use the pigment that's there and drag it out to the outer edge of the flower here. So I'm using what's already here, and I'm just using the water from the brush to drag that watercolor out and let it flow right into the outer edge of the petals. And this is it. This is the magic of my easygoing no line watercolor technique. I start the project out with the paper being wet, the brush being wet, and lots of pigment on the brush. So it's a wet into wet technique. And then I move into a wet into dry. And essentially I am layering colors over top of the colors that I have here. So again, my brush is wet, it's got pigment, my paper is completely dry. So I'm working from all of these petals here, and I'm just working across so that I can give each petal time to dry in between. And you can see that I'm putting my darkest concentration of color in the center of the petals, and then using my brush with just water, dragging that pigment out to the outer edge. And you get that variation from light to dark in the petals, and you get that no line watercolor look because we are used that whisper. You could also use skeleton or some of the other distress inks that are really, really light. Sometimes I'll also use a really light color of the paint that I'm using. So I could have used like a really pale lilac or wisteria or something like that to stamp my images in. So I'm going to just go ahead and move around the flower here, move around this pansy, and you can see that I'm dropping in some color. And again, this technique is called glazing. We've already got that first layer of color underneath. Watercolor is transparent, so we can continue to layer over top of it and make the colors get deeper and richer looking, and then they also will start to glow because of all the transparency that you can achieve from the watercolor. So I like this no-line watercolor technique because it's super simple. You don't have to do a ton of thinking about light source and where your light's coming from. I always focus on my darkest parts of the petals being in the center and working my color out to the outer edges and letting the outer petals be a lot lighter. Okay, so again, I'm just going to go in. Now, this violet that I'm using, this watercolor, is from White Nights, and it's a really nice watercolor. I'll have all of the products that I'm using linked in the description if you're interested in looking them up. But I really encourage you to use whatever you have in your stash to play with this technique. You could use any watercolor you have. If you're using a water-based marker, you could just take the water-based marker and scratch it down on a palette, add some water, and use it as a paint. You can create your own paint using a water-based marker. And I have a bunch of videos where I've used water-based markers and inks as for watercolor, and I'll make sure I link those up in the description as well. Okay, so I'm moving around to this very last petal. Now, this violet paint that I'm using is super strong. So you can see that I'm getting those effects that I want really from doing basically 2 layers. My first blobby layer, and now just my going in and adding this first layer of color. But the thing about watercolor that's important to know is that once it dries, it fades back significantly, often like several shades. So if you really want some rich darks to lights, sometimes you need to work in a couple layers. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish up this petal. You can see that I'm dragging it out to the outer edge, and I've got some really nice dark hues in that center petal. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the leaves while the petals are drying. And I've just got a ton of green, like a sap green paint, just loaded up on my brush here. And I really went in pretty heavy. So my brush was wet, the paper was dry. I'm actually using the silhouette image just as my guide, and I'm just painting right over top of it. Sort of like a coloring book, but I'm just painting right over top of it. Now I've added so much of that pigment. Now it was really intense. And this is actually, yes, it's called Joyce's Mother Green. It's like a sap green. It's from Da Vinci, but you could use any kind of leafy green that you would really like to work with. And you can see that I went around the outer edges of the leaves, and then I just cleaned up my brush, and then I'm using the pigment that's there, and I'm just moving it into the center. Now, if I get too much pigment in an area, I just clean off my brush and then wipe it away with my brush so I can get that light to dark color back. So on the first leaf, you saw me kind of wipe away some of the color afterwards. This color is super super granulating, so we're getting lots of different textures with the color as well. Now I'm going in because I want to add a little bit more leafery, so I'm doing a little bit of flicking from working with the tip of the brush and using a hand motion that just flicks out to create some little like feathery like leafery look with this. So this is a great way that you can practice your brushstroke techniques to add a little bit more to your stamped image. And this is just super fun. And I'm just using the pigment that I have on my brush and just using this flicking motion just with the very, very tip of the brush to create this wispy, leafery, which kind of adds another little dimension to this project. Okay, so now everything is dry. And I'm going to go back in. Now I'm just watering down my pigment, my violet a little bit. And you can see that I'm going back in and adding a third layer. So and I'm going in around the center of each petal. Now you don't have to work super, super fast because this isn't going to dry like instantly. So it's giving us some time to add some of that pigment to the center of this pansy. And then I'm going to clean off my brush. And then I'm going to go back and draw some of that pigment out to the outer edge and just get another layer of color. And you can see that the intensity of this violet is starting to get brighter. So like I said, watercolor, when it dries, it kind of dries back a couple shades and it can get kind of dull. So if you're adding some layers with this glazing technique, this layering technique, you're able to jack up the glow of the flower. So usually with my stamped images, I'm looking at about 3 layers. My first blob layer, my second layer that just gets that first coat of paint on, so to speak, and then my third layer, which jacks up the glow. And you can see how glowy that violet is starting to look. And I'm dropping a little bit of the yellow paint in the center. And I'm just trying to be very careful because it is wet and that yellow is going to bleed into that violet and give me kind of a different look. But that's cool. I'm digging it. So I'm just going to add a little bit of splatter here to kind of finish off this super simple pansy. She's super glowy and she's ready to be made into a card. I hope you've enjoyed this super simple no line watercolor technique, and I would love to see you get out your stamps and watercolor and give it a go. Head over to my website at indigojadeart.com/craftyourjoy and grab all of my stamp set freebies. Thanks so much for watching. Please consider sharing the joy by liking this video and subscribing to this channel. And I'm sharing more card and watercolor tutorial videos for your inspiration right here. So come on in and take a peek at my tutorials. I have a lot to share, and I'll see you next time.